She knocked on my door late at night, her voice low, almost trembling. "Someone's coming." I should have been worried, but all I could think was, "Not before you do." And that was the moment everything between us changed. I remember the sound before anything else. A knock at my door, not loud, not hurried, but soft, almost cautious, like someone testing the silence of the night. I wasn't expecting anyone. It was late enough that most of the building had settled into quiet, and I was half stretched on the couch with a book open, the lamp beside me throwing a pale pool of light across the room. When I opened the door, she was there, my neighbor. She stood in the narrow hallway, her hair pulled back loosely, a few strands escaping to frame her face. She wasn't dressed up, just a light sweater, jeans, the kind of outfit you throw on when you don't expect to be seen. And yet, even in that simplicity, there was something unmistakably graceful about her. Her hand rested against the doorframe, knuckles pale as though she had been about to knock again. Her eyes, calm but guarded, flicked past me for a moment, as if checking the quiet of my apartment before they settled on mine. Then she said, very softly, "Someone's coming." 3 words. They didn't sound like fear, not quite. More like a warning or a secret slipped across the threshold between us. I blinked, trying to catch the meaning, and in that pause I became aware of the details. The faint trace of her perfume, warm, understated, mixing with the cool scent of the hallway. The way her voice seemed to lower naturally when speaking to me, intimate by accident. The curve of her shoulders, drawn tight, as though holding something in. I should have asked her what she meant. Should have leaned on the obvious, "Who?" or "Are you all right?" But I didn't. Instead, my thoughts snagged on her presence itself, on how strange, and yet how natural, it felt to see her standing there in the dim light, so close I could catch the quiet rise and fall of her breath. There was something about the moment that didn't ask to be solved right away, something that wanted only to be felt. I leaned against the doorframe, trying to steady the sudden quickness in my chest. "Someone's coming," she had said, but the way she looked at me, steady and unflinching, made me wonder if she wasn't talking about footsteps in the hallway at all. I tried for a small smile, one that I hoped would loosen the tension between us. But before I could speak, I realized the silence had already deepened, a silence charged not with absence, but with weight, with possibility. And for the first time that night, I understood. Her knocking wasn't just about who might come down the hallway. It was about the two of us, standing there, neither stepping forward nor away, waiting for something unspoken to arrive. Something I wasn't sure either of us was ready to name. For a moment, neither of us moved. The hallway was dim, the old bulbs above giving off that muted, yellow glow that never seemed to brighten more than a few feet around. Somewhere in the building, a door closed with a soft click, followed by the echo of footsteps descending the stairwell. She tilted her head slightly, listening. I found myself doing the same, as though her unease had slipped into me. The footsteps grew faint, then vanished, leaving only the stillness between us. I thought she might explain herself then, but she didn't. Instead, she stood a fraction closer than before, her shoulder nearly brushing mine where I leaned on the doorframe. Her eyes stayed fixed on the shadows stretching down the hall. I could feel her nearness, not a touch, but the suggestion of one, and it pulled at me in a way I hadn't expected. I should have said something practical, something neighborly. But instead, the words that left me were lighter, half joking, though my voice was softer than I meant it to be. "Not before you do." It was meant as humor, a way to ease the tension, but as soon as the words left my lips, they sounded different. Less of a joke, more of an admission I hadn't realized I was making. She turned to me then, eyes narrowing slightly, not in disapproval, but in curiosity. The faintest smile tugged at one corner of her mouth, though it didn't fully form. Her gaze held mine for longer than seemed natural, and in that length of silence, something stirred, something that felt both dangerous and tender. I became aware of the small details, the way her breathing had slowed, almost in rhythm with mine, the faint shadow of tiredness beneath her eyes, the way her hand, still resting against the doorframe, curled slightly, as though resisting the urge to reach further. I swallowed, suddenly conscious of how close we were. The air between us felt charged, as though the dim light itself had thickened. My hand brushed the edge of the door, fingertips grazing the wood, and I had to stop myself from shifting just an inch closer, enough that her shoulder would meet mine. The silence stretched, not awkward, but full, like a thread pulled tight between us. She broke it at last, though only barely, her voice low and deliberate. "You don't take things very seriously, do you?" I smiled faintly, though my heart was still racing. Maybe not, but I noticed things. Her eyes searched mine for a beat, as if weighing the truth of that. Then she exhaled softly, a sound almost like surrender, and for the briefest second, her arm brushed against me as she adjusted her stance. The touch was accidental, fleeting, and yet it sent a quiet warmth through me that lingered long after. In the hush of that hallway, I realized it wasn't footsteps we were listening for anymore. It was each other. The silence between us stretched until it felt like the hallway itself might collapse under its weight. I could see the hesitation flicker across her face. Not fear, not quite, but something quieter, something more fragile. She shifted slightly, her fingers brushing against the doorframe, and then her eyes lifted to mine. "Mind if I come in?" she asked, her voice low, as though the walls might be listening. Just for a minute. There was no hesitation in me. I stepped back, holding the door wider. Of course. As she passed through, her shoulder brushed mine, a whisper of contact that lasted only an instant but left me unexpectedly aware of my own heartbeat. Our fingers grazed as I took the edge of the door, and I felt the light press of her skin against mine, fleeting, unplanned, but more intimate than it should have been. Inside, the room greeted her with its ordinary comforts. The warm glow of a single lamp by the couch, the faint smell of coffee from a cup I'd abandoned earlier, the soft rustle of pages from the book still lying open on the armrest. She paused just inside the door, her arms folded lightly across her chest, eyes scanning the space as though she were memorizing it. "It's cozy," she said finally, her voice softening. "Cozy's just another word for small," I replied, smiling, though I meant it more humbly than as a joke. She let out a small laugh, a real one this time, gentle and unguarded. The sound filled the room in a way that made it feel less like my apartment and more like ours, even if only for that moment. I gestured toward the couch. "Sit, if you'd like." She hesitated, then moved toward it, the loose fall of her sweater shifting as she sank into the cushions. For the first time that night, her posture loosened, her shoulders lowering as though she'd set down something heavy she'd been carrying. I sat across from her, not too close, but close enough to catch the way her fingers traced the rim of the mug I offered. She didn't drink right away, just held it, letting the warmth seep into her palms. "You always keep it this quiet in here?" she asked, glancing at the lamp, the half-lit room. "Mostly," I said. "I like the stillness." She nodded slowly, her eyes lingering on me in a way that made me feel both exposed and seen. There was no rush in her gaze, no demand. Only quiet curiosity, as though she was trying to understand the spaces in me that most people overlooked. I realized then that I hadn't thought once about who she might have been hiding from, or why she had knocked. All I could think about was the way her presence shifted the room itself, how the air seemed warmer, the silence more alive, just because she was sitting there. For the first time that evening, I wasn't listening for footsteps in the hall. I was listening for her. The steam from her cup curled faintly in the lamplight, though she hadn't yet taken a sip. She sat angled toward me, one leg tucked slightly beneath the other, her fingers resting loosely around the mug. There was a quietness to her posture, but not the guarded kind I'd seen at the door. This was different, the kind of quiet that comes when someone is trying to decide how much of themselves they're willing to share. She broke the silence first. "Long day," she said softly, almost as if confessing it to the coffee rather than to me. I nodded, leaning back in my chair. "Work, work, people, everything." She exhaled a short laugh, though it carried no humor. "Some days I feel like I disappear the second I step out of my own door. Like I'm part of the background." Her words caught me off guard. I had never thought of her that way. From my side of the hallway, she seemed to carry herself with a kind of composure that made people notice. Yet here she was, saying the opposite, saying she felt invisible. "You don't disappear," I said quietly. "Not to me." Her eyes lifted then, meeting mine across the small space between us. For a second, it felt like I'd spoken too boldly, too honestly. But instead of pulling back, she held my gaze, as though weighing the sincerity in my voice. She set the mug down on the table, her fingers lingering against the ceramic. "What about you?" she asked. "You're younger. You probably don't know what that feels like yet." I gave a small smile, though the truth of her assumption tugged at me. "Maybe, but I know what it's like to sit in a room full of people and still feel out of place. Like there's some language everyone else speaks that I never learned." Her expression softened. "That's lonelier than being invisible." The words lingered in the air, wrapping the room in a tender stillness. I found myself watching the way her hair slipped over her shoulder when she tilted her head, how her hands folded together as if holding on to something unseen. The conversation slowed, giving space for silence to stretch, but not the kind of silence that ends things. This one deepened them. She reached for the mug again, her hand brushing across my forearm as she did. It was accidental, but the touch stayed with me. Her skin was warm, the contact brief but charged, and it sent a ripple through me that made my words falter. I didn't pull back. Neither did she. We sat like that for a few breaths, her fingers close enough that I could almost believe she had left them there on purpose. My pulse quickened, not from the touch itself, but from the fact that she hadn't moved away. And in that suspended moment, I realized the questions between us weren't about work or loneliness or age. The real questions hadn't been spoken yet, but they were already alive, breathing softly in the space between her hand and mine. The room shifted as the night wore on. The glow of the lamp by the couch seemed softer now, its circle of light a warm island against the gathering shadows. Outside, the faint hum of the city had quieted to a distant murmur. It felt as though the world had pulled back, leaving only the two of us, suspended in the stillness of my apartment. She leaned into the corner of the couch, one arm draped across the backrest, the other resting lightly in her lap. The sweater she wore hung loosely at the wrist, and I found myself noticing the curve of her hand, the elegant way her fingers moved when she gestured, even when she wasn't saying anything at all. I had taken the chair across from her earlier, but as the minutes passed, the distance felt unnecessary. Without thinking, I shifted to sit at the far end of the couch. It wasn't close, not enough to intrude, but close enough that if I stretched my hand out carelessly, my fingertips might graze her knee. She noticed. I could see it in the small lift of her brows, the way her lips pressed together for a moment before softening again. Yet she didn't move away. If anything, her body angled slightly toward me, as though acknowledging what had already been decided between us without a word. Her laughter, when it came again, was quieter now, slower, melting into sighs as the weight of the day settled off her shoulders. At one point, she leaned her head back, eyes closed, and exhaled. The sound was small, almost a release, but it carried through me like something intimate. A strand of hair slipped across her cheek. I wanted, more than I should have, to reach out and brush it back. My hand twitched against my thigh, but I stayed still, caught between restraint and desire. The space between us grew heavier, as though every inch of air carried unspoken meaning. Our knees almost touched, separated by the thinnest margin. I became hyper-aware of the nearness, the faint warmth radiating from her body, the subtle fragrance of her perfume, the quiet rhythm of her breathing. She opened her eyes and turned her head toward me. The look she gave wasn't searching, nor was it playful. It was steady, calm, but underneath it, I could feel the same tension that held me captive. For a heartbeat, neither of us spoke. My chest rose, hers followed, as though we were mirroring each other without trying. The silence stretched like a thread drawn tight, fragile but unbreakable. And though nothing was said, I knew the evening wasn't carrying us further apart. It was drawing us closer, pulling us into a space where even the smallest touch might tip us past the point of no return. I didn't reach for her then, neither did she for me. But the weight of not touching, of almost, became its own kind of intimacy, deeper than words could hold. The air between us was so thick with quiet that it felt alive. Every shift of fabric, every breath, every tiny sound seemed amplified. She was still leaning against the couch, her body angled toward me, and I sat so near that if either of us leaned forward, we'd close the gap entirely. Her eyes flicked away for the first time that evening, toward the floor, then to the mug resting forgotten on the table. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible, more breath than sound. Maybe I shouldn't be here. The words hung there like a fragile thread. They weren't a rejection, not quite. More like a warning to herself, or maybe to both of us. I could see it in her posture, the way her fingers curled inward, the way her shoulders stiffened slightly as though bracing for my answer. I swallowed, my pulse steady but strong in my chest. "I want you here," I said, my voice quiet but certain. She looked back at me then, and the weight of her gaze was almost too much to hold. There was vulnerability in it, yes, but also something deeper, something like longing, like the relief of being seen after years of being overlooked. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, carefully, her hand shifted in her lap until it brushed against mine where it rested on the cushion. The contact was feather-light at first, as though she were testing whether the world would allow it. I didn't pull away. Her fingers stilled against mine, warm and deliberate. The silence deepened, charged now with something undeniable. I let my hand turn slightly, enough that her palm could rest fully against the back of mine. That small motion felt louder than any confession, as if the room itself leaned in to witness it. She drew in a soft breath, her thumb brushing across my knuckles in the faintest of movements. It was such a simple gesture, yet it carried the weight of everything unspoken, the tension, the hesitation, the desire. I felt my throat tighten. My instinct was to say something, to fill the space with words that could make sense of this moment. But the truth was, nothing needed to be explained. It was all there in the way her touch lingered, in the way her eyes softened but did not waver. Her voice came again, quieter still, like a secret she wasn't sure she was ready to admit. "This feels dangerous." I managed a faint smile. "The best things usually do." She exhaled then, a shaky laugh that melted into something gentler. And for a heartbeat, I thought she might lean in, that the inevitable pull between us would finally break the last of the distance. But she didn't. Neither did I. Instead, we stayed there, hands joined, breaths mingling in the small space between us. And though no kiss was shared, I knew that what passed between us in that silence was far more intimate, the kind of closeness that doesn't need to be spoken to be real. Time seemed to blur after that. We didn't speak much. Words felt unnecessary, almost intrusive, against the fragile closeness we had built. Her hand rested in mine, her thumb tracing idle circles across my skin, and I let the silence stretch, savoring the quiet rhythm of being near her. But eventually, the stillness shifted. She glanced toward the window, where the faint glow of streetlights pushed against the curtains, and I saw something pass across her face. A reminder, perhaps, of the outside world, of reality waiting just beyond these walls. "I should go," she whispered, though the way she said it sounded more like regret than conviction. I wanted to tell her to stay, to hold on to the fragile cocoon we'd woven between us. But I also knew the strength it took for her to admit that leaving was the right choice, at least for now. So I simply nodded, squeezing her hand gently before letting it go. She rose slowly, as if her body resisted the decision her mind had made. I stood too, walking with her toward the door. Each step felt heavier than it should have, the kind of weight that comes not from distance, but from the ache of parting. At the door, she paused. Her hand rested against the frame, much like it had when she first appeared that night. But this time, she didn't look guarded. She looked open, almost softened by what we had shared. She turned toward me, her eyes lingering on mine. "Thank you for letting me in." Her voice carried a warmth that settled deep in my chest. I shook my head faintly, a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "Thank you for knocking." The silence that followed wasn't heavy like before. It was gentle, filled with something unspoken but understood. Then, in a motion so subtle I almost thought I imagined it, she reached out. Her palm pressed lightly against my chest, right over my heart. The contact was brief but deliberate, and in that touch I felt everything she didn't put into words: gratitude, hesitation, longing, and a quiet promise that this wasn't the end. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Good night," she whispered, her hand slipping away. I stood in the doorway, watching as she walked down the hallway. The dim light caught in her hair, her steps unhurried but carrying the weight of something newly born between us. She didn't look back, yet I knew she didn't need to. When the hallway swallowed her figure, I closed the door gently, leaning back against it for a moment. The room behind me was the same, the lamp still glowing, the mug still half full, the book still lying open where I'd left it. But everything felt different now, because tonight, she hadn't just knocked. She had let me see her, and in some quiet way, I had let her see me too. And I knew, with a certainty that settled into my bones, that this was only the beginning.